Final Fantasy VII is a game that is embedded in the emotional psyche of video gamers of a certain age. It brings back childhood awe at discovering a world full of emotion, story, life, and sadly even death. It was one of a few video games of an era that moved video games forward as a narrative vehicle for storytelling. Quite simply, it was a watershed moment for video games at the time. So it's no wonder that the remake of Final Fantasy VII was met with such intense reaction from the video gaming community.
Oh my god!
For full disclosure, this review is done by somebody who reacted the way those people reacted when the remake was announced. Final Fantasy VII is not just an incredible game, it's an incredibly important game to me as a person. A lot of my thoughts and opinions on this game in this review will come from an emotional standpoint, because at the end of the day, this is a remake. The word remake is in the title. I'm also reviewing the integrated PlayStation 5 version of the game. I did finish both the remake and the Yuffie intermission before writing this review. Announced as a full rework of Final Fantasy VII, Square Enix wished to bring the wonder and awe of Final Fantasy VII to a new generation of player. But with the original being a near perfect game across the board, can the fires be stoked all over again for a remake of a timeless classic? Well, let's find out 24 years later by getting lost in the world of Final Fantasy VII once again.
You're up.
The world of Final Fantasy VII is completely rejuvenated in an incredible makeover that breathes not just new life into the characters, but changes the very way we perceive and remember characters from our past. The voice acting, facial animations, and overall energy of the city of Midgar is astounding. Every conversation and cutscene is delivered brilliantly. For me, Aeris steals the show. Her subtle voice acting and cute humour is in stark contrast to the smog-laden city and dark themes of Midgar. Due to the brilliant facial animations, there is a lot of emotional weight in the heavier scenes, with Chapter 30 really solidifying the idea that the remake can deliver a new level of emotional punch that just wasn't possible previously when the game was released. The combat looks fantastic, with reflections and lighting in combat, and on hit giving some great feedback to the flow of the action. The music is also wonderful and never misses a beat, apart from one area where I find it a little bit annoying, but other than that, the music is truly epic and really just brings back the fantastic soundtrack of Final Fantasy VII with more pomp, grand in structure and hitting all the right notes at the right time. From a spectacle standpoint, Final Fantasy VII Remake is sensational. It took my breath away from the first cutscene all the way to the end of the game. I had a bit of a love-hate affair with Barrett's English VA, but other than that, the rest of it I could not fault at all.
That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask. And action!
Alrighty then, it's time to talk about the story.
Alrighty then!
One of the core components, some would say the essence of Final Fantasy VII, was its story. Any change to that component is going to be met with severe scrutiny, and rightfully so. Before I delve into this, let's just be clear. If you've never played Final Fantasy VII, then none of this applies. You will play this game with fresh eyes and really enjoy the story. However, I want to make this clear, this game says remake, and it is not a remake. This is a reimagining of the previous story. Key aspects of the story are completely reinvented and just inserted into the timeline of the remake. This is jarring for those who have played the original, and at times makes it feel more like a Kingdom Hearts game than a Final Fantasy VII game that we know and love. Saying all of that though, the story that is there is delivered really well, mostly due to the fantastic cutscenes, animations and voice acting that I mentioned previously. It's cheesy as most Final Fantasy VII games are, but it's par for the course in Final Fantasy games in all honesty, and it works for the most part. I enjoyed the story that they delivered. With the game being split in three, it's just a bit too much filler and padding that impacts not just the flow of the game, but the connection to some of the side characters and the flow of the story, which would have resonated a lot better if there wasn't huge gulfs of space between your key interactions. It just has too much downtime between its most striking moments. Yes, seeing characters I held dear to my heart like Red 13 was incredible, but it's not enough here when, in the end, you don't even know if it's the same Red you loved so much. I didn't like the story they chose to present, and overall, in the end was left crushingly disappointed by it, but that doesn't mean that the story they chose to tell wasn't told well, because it was. So the flow of the game in Final Fantasy VII Remake is odd to say the least. The pacing is way off, the huge differential between standard combat and boss fights is just a bit bizarre to be honest. The combat system is flashy but messy. When it works or comes together it's wonderful, but the game doesn't help at all with it coming together. Moreover, honestly, it feels like the stars need to kind of align for you to have a really solid combat experience. The camera needs work, often you are not able to see attacks coming, in fact attacks are just not brilliantly telegraphed or flagged for you to see throughout the game. It needed a much better tutorial system. I really like the stagger and pressure system, but it needs fine tuning. Aerial enemies are an absolute joke to deal with most of the time, with the gating of access to one character is also an awful design choice, as is not being able to change material on the fly for enemies you are facing, meaning for some fights you just have to either die to restart after you've assessed, or you just slog through it really slowly. The ATB system is okay, but the fact it can get interrupted is frustrating, especially when off-screen characters build ATB so slowly, or if you've saved ATB for a while with the off-screen character, the attack animation gets interrupted, yada yada, it just ruins the flow. It's just not great. The filler quests break up the flow of the main story for far too long, as I touched on previously, and the further I got into the game, the less I wanted to be in the game. The combat system needs tightening up with much better explanation, optimal combos, and the guarding system. I feel a lot of the issues could be solved with a better camera, but I did not like the halfway house that they chose, stuck in the middle of turn-based and ARPG. It didn't hit the peaks of either of those systems and had a lot of the negatives of both. Now, when the combat comes together, like some preordained hand of destiny from God himself, it feels incredible, but those moments were so few and far between in the bigger fights. By the end, I couldn't wait for it to be done with. Like the game itself, the ebb and flow of the combat has pacing issues, but looks wonderful when it comes together.
Embrace me. A touching reunion.
Remaking a touchstone of the medium in this fashion is like creating a big budget TV only special of the opening episode of your favorite anime, but changing the story of the anime in the opening episode. Yeah, it looks great, but is it even the same thing you loved anymore? It is breathtaking, and it's a brilliant way to polish off a definitive nostalgia project. The first 15 or so hours of this remake suggest we are onto something really special. By the conclusion though, you may just feel like it's gone completely off the rails in many ways. Despite my criticism, there is still scope to recover the project in my eyes and the eyes of many hardcore Final Fantasy fans. The foundations are there, we just need to use the original brickwork when building upon it. The story can still hit you in the feels like the original story did if they take some more risks, but all in all, honestly, I don't think they will. Your take on this remake, in my opinion, will be completely molded by what you held dear about the original. For me, it was the happiness and sadness in the story, the tense combat, and the awe-inspiring world, in that order. And sadly, it just doesn't consistently deliver on the first two. Overall, I'm feeling a strong 6 to a light 7 for Final Fantasy VII Reimagined, as I like to call it. But let me know your thoughts, let me know what you thought about the game. I know generally people might disagree with that, but the reviews definitely disagree with it. It's rated very highly by reviewers, but for me, I can't believe this game can be given a 9 or a 10 out of 10. It has way too many minor issues that add up in total to make a big issue, and the story is also a huge issue. But that's my take on it. I love the original, one of my top 5 games of all time. But yeah, that's that. Thank you very much for listening and watching. Take care, and I will see you for another review very soon. Ghost of Tsushima DLC is coming.